a patch of bare dirt. Pale, cracked, baked hard by the sun. A shovel bounces off it. Nothing has grown there in years. Neighbors walk past it and assume the soil is dead. Now picture that same patch 90 days later. The surface is dark, almost black. A handful of it crumbles like chocolate cake between the fingers. Earthworms thread through it in every direction. The roots of newly planted tomatoes slide into it as easily as a knife through warm butter. The plants are tall, green, loaded with fruit. What changed? No rototiller ever touched that ground. No bags of synthetic fertilizer were dragged across the yard. No expensive soil amendment was purchased from a garden center shelf. The transformation required exactly three things. Three things most households throw straight into the garbage every single week: sawdust, cardboard, and kitchen scraps. 90 days. 3 free materials. 0 digging. This is the story of a soil-building method so simple, so inexpensive, and so remarkably effective that it raises a question worth sitting with for a moment. Why has almost nobody heard of it? The answer leads back more than 150 years, through a quiet shift in agricultural science that traded biology for chemistry and local wisdom for corporate convenience. And the trail begins in an unexpected place, a 19th-century laboratory in the German city of Gießen. Section 1. The Trail of a Lost Idea. Before the 1840s, the accepted science of farming rested on a concept called the humus theory. The reasoning behind it was straightforward and rooted in generations of direct observation. Scientists and farmers noticed that the richest, most productive soils were always the darkest ones, the soils packed with decomposed organic matter. They concluded that plants fed directly on this dark material, and they built their entire farming philosophy around protecting and replenishing it. Crop residues went back into the fields after harvest. Livestock manure was collected, aged, and spread. Kitchen waste was composted and returned to the beds. The Amish communities and early American pioneers followed this principle with almost religious devotion, treating the soil as a living inheritance to be passed from one generation to the next. And the land rewarded them for it, producing reliable harvests year after year, decade after decade, without decline. Then a German chemist named Justus von Liebig changed the conversation entirely. In a series of landmark experiments, Liebig demonstrated that plants do not actually consume humus. Instead, they absorb specific mineral nutrients from the soil solution, primarily nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It was a genuine scientific breakthrough, one of the most important in the history of agriculture, but it arrived with an unintended consequence that would reshape how the world thought about dirt for the next 2 centuries. Liebig's mineral theory made it possible to reduce soil fertility to a chemical formula, and anything that can be reduced to a formula can be manufactured in a factory. And anything manufactured in a factory can be packaged, branded, shipped, and sold at a profit. Within decades, a massive fertilizer industry emerged across Europe and North America. Agricultural universities restructured their curricula around chemistry. The older biological methods, the composting, the mulching, the patient cycling of organic residues that had sustained farming for centuries, were pushed steadily to the margins. Not because those methods had failed. They worked precisely as well as they always had. But there was a basic economic reality at play that had nothing to do with science. No corporation could build a profitable business model around sawdust that a local woodworker gives away for free, or flattened cardboard destined for the recycling truck, or banana peels from a kitchen counter. These materials offered no revenue stream, no patentable formula, no recurring sales opportunity. So the textbooks were rewritten, the curriculum moved on, and an entire generation of gardeners grew up believing that soil fertility is something that comes from a store-bought bag. But not everyone followed that path. Scattered across rural Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and beyond, Amish farming communities quietly held on to the older ways. They continued to view soil as a living ecosystem rather than a chemical container. They kept using sawdust, a material that had been a staple of 19th-century farm life, not just for insulating ice houses or lining root cellars to preserve the winter harvest, but as a deliberate strategic soil-building tool. They layered it directly on the ground in a process known as sheet-composting, letting it decompose slowly in place, mimicking exactly what happens on an undisturbed forest floor where no human hand intervenes. That technique never disappeared completely. It just went underground, passed along through conversation from one neighbor to the next, one church community to another, while the rest of the gardening world moved on to the fertilizer aisle. And the most striking part of the whole story? The biology behind it is not just valid, it is thoroughly understood by modern soil science. Which raises a perfectly fair question. If sawdust works this well, why do most gardening books still warn people to keep it far away from their gardens? Section 2. The one mistake that gave sawdust a terrible reputation. This is the part of the story that surprises even seasoned gardeners who have been working the soil for 30 or 40 years. Because the warnings about sawdust are not entirely wrong. There is a real, well-documented problem with using it in a garden. But the problem only shows up when sawdust is used one specific way. And that one mistake has been repeated so often and described so dramatically in gardening literature that it has scared multiple generations away from one of the most effective soil-building materials available anywhere. The technical term for the problem is nitrogen immobilization. Here is what it means in plain language. Sawdust has an extremely high carbon-to-nitrogen ratio, roughly 500 to 1. For comparison, the ideal ratio for healthy decomposition is closer to 30 to 1. When fresh sawdust gets mixed directly into the soil, rototilled in, shoveled in, stirred in by any method, it triggers an intense feeding response from the billions of microorganisms living in the ground. Those tiny creatures need nitrogen to break down all that carbon, and they pull it from the surrounding soil with astonishing speed and efficiency. The result is predictable and devastating for any plant trying to grow nearby. Roots suddenly find themselves in a nitrogen desert. Leaves turn yellow, growth stalls. Vegetables sit in the ground, stunted, pale, and starving, looking worse with each passing week. This is real. It happens. And it is exactly what gardening guides describe when they issue their standard warning. Never put wood materials in your garden soil. But those guides leave out the most important part of the story. The entire problem vanishes, completely and reliably, when the sawdust stays on the surface of the soil instead of being mixed into it. That single distinction, surface layering versus soil incorporation, is the dividing line between a disastrous experiment and a genuine breakthrough. And the pioneers and Amish gardeners who developed sheet mulching understood this perfectly, long before any laboratory confirmed the science behind it. In their system, sawdust was never buried in the root zone. It sat on top of the ground, open to the air, where a completely different decomposition pathway took over. Fungi and aerobic bacteria colonized the sawdust from above and drew their necessary nitrogen not from the deep soil reserves where plant roots feed, but from the nitrogen-rich organic layers placed directly beneath the sawdust itself. Kitchen scraps, green plant material, the very household waste that would otherwise end up in a landfill or a separate compost pile across the yard. Think of how a good sandwich works. The green scraps on the bottom supply the nitrogen. The brown sawdust on top provides the carbon. The two materials meet in the middle, right at the interface, and decomposition happens there, precisely at that contact zone, without ever drawing resources from the plant roots below. As this process unfolds over days and weeks, something elegant and self-regulating takes place. Microorganisms steadily convert the organic nitrogen in the kitchen scraps into forms that plants can absorb directly: ammonium and nitrate ions. These nutrients accumulate at the base of the mulch layer, and when rain falls or the garden is watered, They filter gently downward into the root zone beneath. The plants receive a slow, steady, perfectly paced supply of exactly what they need, delivered at a rate they can actually use without waste or burn. Meanwhile, the sawdust layer sitting above continues to serve as a dense, weed-smothering blanket that locks in soil moisture and keeps ground temperatures cool and stable through the hottest months of summer. No nitrogen robbery, no yellow leaves, no stunted crops, just a quiet, self-sustaining system doing exactly what a healthy forest floor has been doing, without anyone's help, for millions of years. Section 3. Building the layers, a step-by-step blueprint. So what does this actually look like when someone steps outside and does it? Picture standing at the edge of that bare, hard patch of dirt, the kind of ground that makes a gardener's heart sink a little just looking at it. There is no need to dig it up, no need to rent a machine, no need to spend an afternoon pulling weeds on hands and knees. The entire philosophy of this method rests on one principle. The ground stays exactly as it is. Start at ground level. Mow whatever is growing there, grass, weeds, clover, anything, down as short as possible. That flattened vegetation becomes part of the system. It does not need to be removed, bagged, or hauled anywhere. Now comes the first layer. Plain brown corrugated cardboard. Large, flat sheets work best. Any plastic packing tape, glossy stickers, or shipping labels should be pulled off first. Nothing non-biodegradable belongs in this bed. Lay the cardboard directly over the mowed surface, overlapping each piece by at least 6 to 8 inches. Every gap matters. No sunlight should reach the soil underneath. This cardboard performs two critical jobs simultaneously. It smothers every existing weed and dormant seed below it by cutting off all light. And it serves as an enormous carbon source that earthworms will methodically consume from below over the coming weeks. Once the cardboard is positioned, soak the entire layer thoroughly with a garden hose until every sheet is saturated and limp. This moisture bonds the cardboard to the ground beneath and immediately begins inviting microbial colonization along the wet surfaces. Next, directly on top of the soaked cardboard, spread a 2 to 3 inch layer of nitrogen-rich green material. Mixed kitchen scraps are ideal. Fruit peels, vegetable trimmings, coffee grounds, crushed eggshells, the daily accumulation of organic waste that most kitchens produce in abundance. In a traditional compost bin placed in a far corner of the yard, a meaningful portion of the nutrients these scraps release during breakdown would leach sideways into the surrounding soil or simply evaporate into the air. Wasted. But here, placed directly inside the garden bed where plants will grow, every bit of nutrient value stays exactly where it is needed most. Now comes a detail that many modern guides have quietly dropped, but that 19th century farmers considered essential. Sprinkle a thin, even dusting of fully cooled wood ash, roughly a 1/4 inch, directly over the kitchen scraps. Wood ash serves as a natural pH buffer. When fresh organic matter first begins to decompose, it generates acids that can temporarily slow the biological activity needed for breakdown. The alkaline nature of wood ash neutralizes those acids on contact and simultaneously provides a boost of calcium and potassium, two nutrients that most garden soils need more of. The chemistry behind this step has not changed since the 1800s. Only the awareness of it has faded. Finally, cover everything with a generous 3 to 4 inch layer of fresh, untreated sawdust. This is the protective cap that holds the entire system together. The fine particles of sawdust absorb and hold moisture the way a sponge does. When wet, sawdust naturally compacts into a dense, cohesive mat that weed seeds simply cannot push through from below. Fungal threads begin colonizing it within days, starting the long, slow conversion of wood fiber into soil organic matter. And because the layer is thick enough to act as insulation, it protects the decomposing scraps underneath from drying out during summer heat waves and from washing away during heavy downpours. The bed is built. Total elapsed time for a modest garden patch, a single afternoon. Now comes the part where the gardener steps back and biology takes over. Section 4. What happens underground? The 90-day transformation. What unfolds over the next 3 months beneath that quiet layer of sawdust is one of the most remarkable construction projects in the natural world, and it proceeds entirely on its own schedule, without any human supervision or intervention. This is not the fast, hot composting method that happens inside a tumbling drum or a carefully managed pile. There is no need to turn anything, check temperatures, or worry about maintaining a precise green-to-brown ratio. This is cold composting, slower, cooler, and powered by an entirely different crew of organisms than the thermophilic bacteria that dominate hot piles. Sawdust is composed largely of lignin, a tough structural compound that locks together the cellulose fibers in wood. Most bacteria cannot break lignin down efficiently, but fungi can. Within the first 2 weeks, white rot and brown rot fungi begin threading their way through the sawdust layer in every direction, producing specialized enzymes that disassemble wood fiber at a molecular level. These fungal networks accomplish something else that rarely gets the credit it deserves. They extend far beyond the mulch layer, reaching deep into the soil below, where they form a living web of microscopic filaments connecting decomposing organic matter above to plant roots beneath. Sir Albert Howard, the British agronomist widely regarded as the father of modern organic farming, spent years carefully documenting this exact relationship, how fungal threads serve as a transport network, shuttling nutrients from decaying material directly to the roots of living plants. But the most dramatic part of the transformation depends on a creature that the naturalist Charles Darwin, in the final years of his life, described as the most important animal in the history of the world: the earthworm. Specifically, species like Eisenia foetida, commonly known as the red wiggler, are drawn upward through the soil by the moisture gradient and the softening cellulose of the cardboard layer. They arrive in enormous numbers, migrating from the deeper, harder subsoil toward the rich, damp interface where cardboard meets earth. Their function is straightforward and relentless: consume the decomposing cardboard and the breaking down kitchen scraps, pass the material through their bodies, and deposit it behind them as castings, dense, dark, extraordinarily nutrient-rich pellets that represent the closest thing in nature to a perfect, balanced plant food. Research conducted at Ohio State University has shown that earthworm castings do considerably more than simply nourish plants. They actively suppress common soil diseases like root rot and create chemical conditions that discourage pests such as spider mites and aphids from establishing colonies. The worms are not just recyclers. They are the renovation crew, silently rebuilding depleted soil from the inside out, one casting at a time. Here is what the transformation timeline typically looks like. During the first 30 days, bacteria and fungi concentrate on the easiest material, the simple sugars and starches in the kitchen scraps. The cardboard layer softens, darkens, and begins to tear when tugged. The scraps consolidate into a moist, dark fungal mat. The sawdust layer above remains largely intact during this phase, quietly doing its job as insulation and moisture storage. Between day 30 and day 60, the earthworm population surges dramatically. Time-lapse observations in field studies have shown that a healthy worm population can process a full inch of layered organic material in as little as 20 days. By the end of this second phase, the top inch of what was once hard, lifeless, compacted dirt has been replaced entirely by a layer of dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling earthworm castings. By day 90, the hard boundary between old soil and new material has dissolved. The ground that once shed water and resisted a shovel now has the spongy, dark, yielding consistency of mature forest soil. It holds water instead of rejecting it. Roots move through it without resistance. The transformation is not cosmetic. It is structural, chemical, and biological, all the way down. The bed is ready. Pull back the remaining sawdust on the surface, cut a small opening through what is left of the fragile cardboard, and set transplants directly into the richest, most alive earth that patch of ground has held in years. possibly ever. Section 5. A garden that gives back more than it asks. There is a deeply practical side to this method that deserves honest attention, particularly for anyone whose knees, back, hips, or shoulders have started voicing their opinions more loudly with each passing garden season. Because this system is entirely no-till, there is no digging involved at any stage, no wrestling with a heavy rototiller across uneven ground, no hauling 50-pound bags of amendments across the yard in a wheelbarrow. The physical labor of setting up the bed is genuinely light, laying flat cardboard, scattering kitchen scraps from a bucket, spreading sawdust with a rake or by hand. Once the layers are in place, the ongoing maintenance shrinks to almost nothing. Water the bed occasionally to keep the mulch layer moist during dry spells. That is the primary ongoing task. The weed suppression alone fundamentally changes what gardening feels like. That thick sawdust cap blocks all sunlight from reaching dormant weed seeds buried in the soil below, and any stray seed that drifts in from above and lands on the surface struggles to push roots through the dense, compacted mat of damp sawdust. Gardeners who have used this method consistently describe a reduction in hand weeding of up to 90% compared to traditional open soil beds. And when the occasional weed does appear, its roots are shallow and loose in the soft mulch layer. It pulls free with 2 fingers and no bending. Then there is the water savings, which in a hot summer can border on astonishing. When traditional exposed soil gardens demand daily watering just to keep plants alive, this layered system quietly behaves like the floor of a shaded forest. The cardboard layer underneath functions as a vapor barrier, dramatically slowing the evaporation of moisture from the deeper soil. The sawdust above acts as a reservoir, absorbing rainfall and irrigation like a sponge, and then releasing it downward gradually over days. Field observations from gardeners across a range of climates suggest this combination can reduce watering frequency by 70 to 80% compared to bare soil beds. Some practitioners of this method have reported watering their vegetable beds only twice across an entire summer growing season. The method adapts to virtually any scale or setting. A large open backyard, a set of raised wooden beds along a fence line, a few deep containers arranged on a sunny apartment patio. The underlying biology does not care about the container, it responds to the materials. For a patio pot, simply reduce the proportions. 1/2 inch of kitchen scraps, 2 inches of sawdust over the top. The same organisms move in, the same process unfolds, and the same dark, rich soil develops. And the bed does not stop improving after one season. Each year, a fresh, thin layer of scraps and sawdust can be added directly over the existing surface without disturbing what is underneath. The system compounds on itself. The soil deepens. The earthworm population grows larger and more established. What begins as a rescue project for a patch of dead ground becomes, over 2 or 3 seasons, some of the most consistently productive soil a home garden has ever seen. Closing. There is something quietly powerful about gathering materials the rest of the world considers worthless. Sawdust swept off a workshop floor, cardboard flattened for the recycling truck, vegetable peels scraped into the kitchen trash, and watching them become the darkest, richest soil a garden has ever held. The farming communities who kept this practice alive across generations were not chasing a trend. They were honoring a simple principle. What the land gives, the land receives back. That principle never stopped being true. It simply stopped being profitable for anyone to teach. 90 days. 3 ordinary materials. No machinery, no chemicals, no specialized knowledge required. Just the quiet patience of stepping aside and letting biology do what biology has always done, long before anyone tried to sell a shortcut. Save the cardboard. Keep the kitchen scraps. Find a local woodworker who is glad to part with a pile of clean, untreated sawdust. Lay the layers down on the worst patch of ground in the yard. Walk away. And in 3 months, come back and push a hand into soil so dark and so alive that it barely resembles the hard, pale dirt that was there before. The greatest secrets of the earth have always been hidden in plain sight, right beneath the surface. This is one of them. And now it belongs to anyone willing to try. Happy gardening, from Rooted Grace.